It's okay. Don't have any more jokes.
Make sure it's on.
Shouldn't this be open?
No, because he doesn't need. Neither of you need it. It's just,
Are we sure Joe is here?
yeah, he's right there. He's ready to go whenever you. So you just start talking. Say like, "Excuse me." Yeah, just talk into it. Say, just talk into
What?
it. Just talk into it.
Testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. Thank you very much. All right. Ready to go? Finish your sentences. Okay. Our dinner speaker, Joe Stiglitz, needs no introduction here, but I want to touch on some of the highlights. Before that, I want to comment that he's an Amherst man, like me, and he's been a great friend of mine for many years, I suspect, than we can count. And he was an early member of the Center in 2001, the same year he joined the faculty at Columbia. He has spoken several times at our conferences, and I'm very glad he agreed to speak here tonight. Joe has walked an impressive path. I'll note some of the milestones, not that it's necessary. He's held senior positions at the World Bank and was chairman, I know that means chair, of the Council of Economic Advisors. He received the Nobel Prize in Economics 2001 with George Akerlof and Michael Spence for their analyses of markets with asymmetric information. Over the years, he has worked on a wide range of topics, including income distribution, asymmetric risk, corporate governance, public policy, macroeconomics, and globalization. Among his many books, one is People, Power, and Profits. Another is Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy. And still another is Globalization and Its Discontents Revisited. The floor is yours, Joe.
Well, thank you, Nat, and it's a real pleasure to be here again. I think the center's emphasis on capitalism and society, not just the economy, is absolutely crucial, and I'm going to talk a lot about that more broad view of what do we mean by a good society and what kind of economy delivers a good society. But before I get into and those of you who know me know probably the answer before I give it. Yeah, some of you could probably give the speech for me, so maybe I should just sit down. I think neoliberal capitalism does not deliver a good society. It delivers the antithesis of a good society. But I think any large modern economy has to be decentralized, so it has to be a market economy. I'll come back to that. But it has to be a very different kind of market economy than the kind of market economy that we've had in the last 40 years. But before I get there, I wanted to talk a little bit about Ned and my long-term friendship with Ned. Maybe where I should begin is where Partha began, which was reading the paper on the Golden Rule, which all of us did as students. Really a beautiful paper that very elegantly presents a very, very deep idea. I think is one of the things that made it. I was already a graduate student, and so I was glad that I had chosen to become an economist, and it is really a beautiful paper. I was going to mention, that one of the things that Ned has always done is gone beyond standard economics. And Ned mentioned that we both went to Amherst College, and that's related to the talk we had at lunch, that we're both part of the same kinship circle, that there is something about having gone to Amherst College and shared those experiences. But one aspect of Amherst was that it was a liberal arts college that emphasized these broader views. We all had to take philosophy. It was sort of, I took, as an economics major, only 3 semesters of economics. The rest was in literature and in history and in philosophy and mathematics. So, I think it may have given both Ned and I a different perspective on economics and where we thought the field ought to go. Those of you who know Ned know that one aspect of culture that Ned is very fond of is music, in particular singing. And one of the things, I don't know if Ned remembers, Ned and I are probably I don't know how many of you know about the Spoleto Music Festival. It's a great music festival in Italy. And I think Ned and I are probably 2 of the only economists who have performed in Spoleto. But I should say, it was a moment where the music festival thought it needed to round itself out by having some more general discussions going beyond music. So while Ned could have performed, it's not my thing. And but Ned gave at that Spoleto conference a beautiful paper, which I remember to that day. It must have been 15 years ago, which was about art and economics and how trends in art may have be mirrored realism and abstraction and by trends in economics. I'm not sure it was ever published. He doesn't remember. I'm not sure it's correct, but it was a really interesting idea that I've thought a lot about since. Let me just share one more experience that Ned and I had together. Many of you may know, some of you, that Ned has had a lot of good students here at Columbia, elsewhere too, but here at Columbia, very devoted students, and some of them very successful students, and some of them very successful not just in economics, but in making money, or inherited it, which is they chose the right parents, which I think is another great achievement. So, and one, I don't know, again, of his great students was Dr. Park, who owned the Asian Airlines and some other Kumo, one of the chaebol in Korea. So one of the times we were together in Seoul for the Econometric Society meetings, Dr. Park invited Ned, me, and Ken Arrow to one of those places where you have dinner with 4 people, and the 4 of us together, and 8 geisha girls, but they weren't geisha girls. They were 8 people who present. It was not PC, and we probably shouldn't admit that, but it was before that. And as today, at the end of those meals, you're supposed to do karaoke. And
Story's not getting better.
but Ned loves karaoke, so it was Ned was in his environment that he really loved, and I may have many strengths, but singing is not one of them, as my children will tell you. But anyway, Ned nudged me up to do karaoke. Well, fortunately, it was only in front of Ken Arrow, so it wasn't. It was, and Dr. Park. So I didn't. It wasn't very embarrassing. And I don't know if you remember, it was O Sole Mio that we had to sing. Anyway, it was a memorable evening. Well. So that's all part of a good society, but it had a little bit too much inequality. But a nice aspect of the inequality in Korea, I mean, I shouldn't say it, is that it was all very private as opposed to the kind of public inequality that we have here in America. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about inequality. I'm going to talk about, first, as I say, some conceptual ideas about what we might mean by a good society and the relationship between economics and a good society, and then as some general principles, and then talk about what kind of economy delivers on a good society. So I'll begin with just a few simple ideas that I think most of you would agree with. And the first is that the economy is supposed to serve society, not the other way around. However we mean serving society, sometimes one gets the feeling that workers should accept lower wages in order to make our economy work better, even if they, the end, are worse off. So the first is the economy should serve society. The second is that in thinking about serving society, what we really should mean is helping create a good society. And by that, one means going beyond what economists always talk about, Pareto efficiency. That may be a necessary condition, but it's certainly not a sufficient condition. And much of my earlier work and some of Neg's was trying to point out that the market economy actually, without appropriate regulations, is not Pareto efficient. But it's more than that. Some of Neg's earlier work was thinking about what is meant by a fair and just society. If you get his newest book, not the one that's about to come out, but his last book, where his memoir, he talks about his time at the Institute for Banks at Stanford and the influence of Rawlsian philosophy during that period, and it gave rise to a number of papers about what is a just tax system from the perspective of Rawls. Ideas about thinking about justice behind the veil of ignorance. In his more recent work, Ned has emphasized valuing creativity, dynamism, but there's a whole strand of work that I'm going to come to refer to very briefly later, which is that while standard economics assumes that individuals are born with well-formed preferences, in fact, as was brought up several times today, parents, we work very hard to try to shape our children. The education is engaged in trying to shape children. And you wouldn't do that if you didn't think preferences were to some extent or endogenous. And that means we have to think about, first of all, it means the whole framework of Pareto efficiency really doesn't apply. Pareto efficiency only works as a construct when preferences are fixed. And once we go on to a world where preferences are endogenous, we have to ask really the hard questions about what we mean by a good society and what we mean by good people. That is to say, a good society we would think of as creating good people. And I'm not going to be able to defend what I'm going to say now, but I think most of us would agree that attributes like honesty, trust, valuing creativity are all attributes that we think of as attributes of good individuals that would be created by a good society. And to get a little bit ahead of the story, it's very clear that our economy or our society has been creating some individuals who are not exemplar in those characteristics, including one that served as president of the United States. And I would argue that it's not an accident. It is an inherent part of the system. So that's the second point I wanted to emphasize. And third is that among the attributes of a good society are ideas like freedom, part of individual freedom, individual expression. But the agenda of freedom has been captured by the extreme right, by the Freedom Caucus. And what I want to argue a little bit tonight is that that agenda of freedom needs to be recaptured, that they have misunderstood what freedom means. And in a way, that could get Isaiah Berlin, who was a great philosopher of the last century, put it, I thought, much better than most economists do when he said, freedom for the wolves is death for the sheep. We as economists put it more prosaically, saying there are externalities. If you don't wear a mask or you don't get a vaccine, other people may die. If your freedom to carry an AK-47 reflects a risk of somebody else's loss of the right to life. And that means from a societal point of view, if we're thinking about a good society, we have to make trade-offs. We're always making those trade-offs as a society. It's not absolute freedom, it's trade-offs. But in the examples I just gave, I think it's obvious that most reasonable people would say that the inconvenience of wearing a mask and that loss of freedom is much less important than somebody's loss of life. So if there is that trade-off in the way I describe, it's very clear how a good society would make those trade-offs. One of the things that has changed in economics over the last 50 years is that 50 years ago, externalities were relegated to the end of a textbook, principles textbook, and you never got to them. And they were second order. They were a little wrinkle. You say, okay, yes, we have to deal with externalities, and then there'd be some reference to Pagoo, and you say you have corrective taxation, and that's the end of the story. But what's happened now is the externalities have moved to, I think, the center of the stage. They are first order importance. Climate change is the most important example, but pandemics are public health externality, and they're also positive externalities. Ned talks about innovation, dynamism. there are enormous positive externalities from those kinds of economic activities. One of the things that was referred to in the sessions was importance of trust in our society. And if people behave badly, dishonestly, there is an erosion of trust, and that is an externality. The degree of trust in society is like a public good, and there can be an erosion of that. One of the things, my work with Bruce Greenwald showed that whenever there are imperfections of information, asymmetries of information, or incomplete risk markets, that is always, there are pecuniary externalities become important, and that markets are not efficient. Another corollary of all of this strand of work in economics is also that corrective taxation is part of the solution, but only part. You need regulations, you need nonlinear interventions, public investment, so that the simplistic view of Pagoo that you could just have a corrective tax and that one sentence was all that you needed to know about externalities was wrong. So the point that I want to make is that once we recognize that one person's freedom is another person's unfreedom, that you cannot avoid the issue of these trade-offs, and the naive discussion of being a freedom party is really silly. In some sense, the recognition of this is part of, goes back thousands of years. The Ten Commandments is a set of regulations. It said that you cannot steal my property. That was a regulation, it was a restriction on the behavior of the thief. We take it for granted because it seems so obvious that we want to stop the thief from stealing our property. But it was a trade-off between the freedom of the thief and the freedom of the rights of the property owner. And that's true of thou shalt not kill, or many of the other of the Ten Commandments. So our society, organized society, is based on regulations and a recognition that there are externalities and there are these trade-offs in freedoms. But the one aspect of, I've talked about a critical aspect of freedom, which is the freedom to do harm, but there's a broader way of looking at notions of freedom, which is the freedom to act, the freedom to do, including the freedom to live up to your potential. If you don't have, somebody without any resources really doesn't have any freedom to act. He does what he can to survive. That's not freedom. And so that means we even the issue of redistribution needs to be thought through this lens, I think, of, yes, you're taking away the freedom of somebody that you tax, but you're expanding the freedom to act of other individuals. And the question is, how do you evaluate those? Now, some people would say that the individual who you're taxing, say a wealthy individual, put aside the instrumental issues about whether that has adverse incentive effects, but that he has a moral claim to that income. And I think that's, the grounds for that, I think, are very weak. And they're weak for two reasons. First of all, most of our endowments are either a result of luck. I knew a wealthy person who talked about his children winning in the sperm bank. a sperm lottery. And that is to say, they show that was just the luck of who his parents were. But the notion, as I said before, we don't choose our parents. There's always that element of luck. And if you have an inheritance, that's an element of luck. But it's even more, a lot of the wealth in the advanced countries is attributable to exploitation, at least to some degree. More than half the wealth in the southern part of the United States was slavery. The slaves accounted for more than 50% of the value of the wealth at the time of the South at the time of the Civil War. Tomorrow there's a lecture here at Columbia by Amitav Ghosh where he documents the extent to which the opium trade gave rise to a lot of the wealth in the United States. And you go through modern versions. Yes, you may say some creativity of Gates, but he engaged in anti-competitive behavior that was, he found guilty of anti-competitive behavior in Europe, United States, and Asia. So yes, he should have gotten something for his creativity, but how much? If we believe in competitive markets, it's hard to believe that it would be anywhere near corresponding to what he got. And the same thing, we can go through the other wealthy individuals. Some of them, like Sackler, have engaged in even worse forms of exploitation, which get reflected in a macroeconomic consequence of declining life expectancy in the United States. I mean, there aren't many individuals who can claim, or families that can claim of success of changing a macroeconomic variable like the average life expectancy of a country. It's really an achievement in a way, but it garnered for them billions of dollars. So the first point I want to make is that there are questions about the moral legitimacy of not all, but at least much of the wealth or some of the wealth. And secondly, since in general equilibrium, the returns on factors, on savings, on wages, are themselves a function of the distribution of asset endowments, those factor returns themselves have no inherent moral legitimacy. That was all by way of a footnote in saying that we need to think deeply about the trade-offs as we gauge in redistribution, but they are an expansion of some individuals' freedom and a contraction of other individuals' freedom. The next to last point I want to raise is that there are a number of cases where restraints on freedom can actually expand freedoms in a meaningful way. And the obvious example is a stoplight. It says one person can go one way and the other person can go the other way. It's a loss of your freedom. You aren't allowed to just willy-nilly go across the intersection. But here in New York, without stoplights, you would have gridlock, and nobody could go anywhere. So that simple regulation, which is a restraint, actually expands all of our freedoms. Well, that's true for an awful lot of things, because without public investment in infrastructure, technology, education, we would be a much poorer country. Who the spending on that created the internet or the mRNA platform that saved us in COVID-19, that was all financed by collective action, by government. So we have to admit that, our freedom to act, we might not even be able to be free to have this meeting if it had not been for the mRNA platform that was a result of public investment.
Were you paid by Pfizer?
Was I paid by Pfizer? No. The point is that collective action can be individually freeing. And the final point is that goes back to the point of endogenous preferences, and the point that was made so, I thought, powerfully at lunch today is that to a large extent what our views are shaped by those around us. You call it kingship. But they actually shape what we want, what our preferences are, to use the language of economics. And in a way, that's an example of an externality. And if other people are selfish, you become more selfish. And so as a good society, we have to think about that. If we succeed in indoctrinating our children to not pollute or to eat more vegetarian, then we will have less need for regulations concerning littering or polluting. So the nature of our societally formed preferences really interacts with the nature of the regulations that we need to, and the extent to which those regulations are binding. Finally, I do want to mention, to come back to a liberal arts education, I think liberal arts education, one of the advantages of liberal arts education is that it is free. It helps you understand the forces that have shaped you and shaped our society, and begins a lifelong inquiry that gives you greater tools for more agency. So that's just a self-serving advertising for what we do at Columbia and our other liberal arts colleges. So let me now come to the second part of the talk, and that is what kind of economy creates a good society. Well, it should be clear that I think that unfettered capitalism doesn't do that. The idea that capitalism without regulations will deliver is absurd. And obviously, it's not Pareto efficient. One of the major achievements, I think, of economics over the last 50 years is to show that even in narrow terms it fails, but even when we broaden our vision to include the broader elements of global society, of a good society, it fails. And you can see it today in our so many aspects of what's happened in the United States and some other countries. Growth since the advent of neoliberal capitalism has been down. Inequality has been up. Life expectancy has been down. We've had the instability, the greatest financial crisis in 80 years. Insecurity is up. One of the questions that was posed was in the discussion today was why, if things seemed we're better off now than we were 40 years ago, why are people so unhappy? One of the reasons is they feel a lot of insecurity. And one of the aspects of an economy marked by a lot of inequality is there are a lot of rungs of the ladder you can fall down, and they're very far apart. And there is a sense of insecurity. And one of the things I think is palpable and documented strongly. There was some reference, some of the discussion today had a more optimistic view of what's happened on inequality than I have. A few statistics, though, should help us keep in mind, besides the fact that life expectancy is down, which is, I think, a good measure of well-being, and health disparities between the richest of Americans and the poorest Americans are markedly up. But there are other things. The real wage of those at the bottom are at roughly the same level that they were 65 years ago. I mean, I think that's amazing. Partha was giving all those statistics about what's happened over the last 70 years, and to say, all that growth, all that per capita income increasing, and yet in America, those at the bottom having shared in that increase. And then we have to face the existential reality of climate change. Our market economy has not, the data, that enormous growth has pretended that we have no planetary boundaries. And the market has been worse than that because it's resisted the regulations that would protect us from these excesses. The market has incentives to do that. If you're Exxon, you make money from polluting, and you pay people to tell the world that there's no such thing as climate change. So we could go on about the other failures, childhood diabetes crises, but the climate change is the existential crisis that we face. And then you think about, yes, innovation and dynamism, that's great, but think about what is the business model of Silicon Valley, which has been such a source of innovation. It's building a better advertising engine to take advantage of you. You can say, well, to get you messages so you'll go spend more money to ruin the world a little bit more. But do you really believe that it is the most efficient way of spending our scarce R&D resources to have it focused on building a better advertising engine? Wouldn't it have been better to have a focus on saving the planet, or than creating more unskilled unemployment? So the final point, I know Ned is coming up here and telling me I have to shut up. So the final point I want to make about neoliberalism is I don't think it's a sustainable system. Neoliberal capitalism is not sustainable, not just because of the climate change, not just because it has this tendency to monopoly power, which has been documented. The increase in monopoly power has been well documented. Adam Smith talked about it, but we are experiencing it. But also because it creates individuals who are untrustworthy. And you can't run a market economy with untrustworthy individuals. So it is a system which will eventually devour itself. So we have to look for alternatives. It, as I said, has to be decentralized. It has to be forms of capitalism, but what I would call progressive capitalism, democratic capitalism. You can use the names are not so important, as the notion that they have to involve a richer ecology of institutions, not just profit and not just state and for-profit, but nonprofits, Columbia University as an example, cooperatives, NGOs, and I think there needs to be more dynamism in the creation of social institutions. So the problem, one of the problems with neoliberal capitalism was it said that we were at the end, we were in an equilibrium. We were the end of innovation from a social perspective. But we're in an evolutionary world where the world's always changing, and we always have to adapt our institutions, our economy, our democracy, to those new situations and to those new, and that I think is why the word progressive, I like the word progressive, because it emphasizes the fact that there's not an equilibrium here, but it's a constant change in our society in an attempt, and we never get there, in an attempt to create the good society. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much.
Did you want me to answer questions? No.
No,
No, they're too hostile.
we can't do it because we have constraints.